Good evening. Welcome. I'm Kirk Freudenberg, chair of the Department of Classics here at Yale, and it's my honor and delight to welcome all of you to the third annual Amory and Adam Parry lecture. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to ask you all to please snuff out all cell phones and electronic devices, thusly. And second, I'd like to take just a little bit of time to talk about the series to which tonight's lecture belongs. Started just 2 years back, this series aims to highlight the work of scholars of ancient literature who excel in the methods and talents that were once so beautifully exemplified by Amory and Adam Parry, the thoughtful and detailed analysis of Greek and Latin texts, as well as the further receptions of those texts in ways that are at once adventurous, elegantly written, and critically informed. The Bingham Library is the right place for this lecture. You can see their pictures right there on the wall. It houses the books that once belonged to Amory and Adam Parry, as well as the PhD dissertations of just some of the many students whom the dynamic husband and wife pair would have worked with in the late 60s and early 70s before meeting their tragic and simultaneous end in the motorcycle accident of 1971. Both Adam and Anne were leading scholars of Homer and Homeric criticism, as well as the study of other ancient texts, especially Thucydides and Virgil. It is in the spirit of their wide-ranging, elegantly written, and exciting scholarship that we invited Joseph Russo, a proud former colleague and protege of both Anne Amory and Adam Parry, to give the inaugural lecture 2 years ago, and it was with equal commitment to that spirit that we asked Gordon Braden, one of the world's leading scholars of Renaissance literature, PhD, Yale, 1975, to give the Parry lecture last year. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Ellen Oliensis. I'm going to call you Ellen rather than Nellie for the purposes of the introduction, welcoming her to the stage. Ellen fits the bill of this lecture beautifully. A professor of classics at the University of California at Berkeley, Ellen can deal with our lousy spring weather here in New Haven because she is a Yaley several times over. She took her BA in literature summa cum laude here at Yale in 1981 before heading off to do a PhD in Comp Lit at Harvard. From there to Princeton for a year of teaching in classics and humanities, and then to Harvard for a 3-year stint at the Harvard Society of Fellows. In 1992, she returned to Yale, first as an assistant, then associate professor in classics and humanities. And then in 1999, she followed the warm zephyrs back to Berkeley, where she quickly established herself as a key member of one of the most outstanding classics programs in the country. Her daughter is now finishing her freshman year here at Yale. Wave to us. She's back there somewhere. Okay. Rebecca, I think. Right? Ellen first came to my attention as a Horatian scholar, first by way of what is now a classic article on the erotics of Horace's Epodes, then with a magnificent first book, Horace and the Rhetoric of Authority, which appeared from Cambridge in 1998. The book explores how Horace's poems, all of them, satires, epodes, epistles, odes, construct the literary and social authority of their author. It talks of poetic personae not just as rhetorical acts, but as stylizations that do important cultural work, responding to the demands put on poets to look certain ways at certain times, as social acts playing to multiple audiences. It's a fantastic book, just as important today as the day it first appeared. And like everything Ellen Oliensis has published, it shows just how much meaning is there to be had from the small details in the ticks and turns and colors of any given snippet of Latin poetry. She's extremely good at this. That same brilliant penchant for teasing out the bigger hidden context from what's there before us in the complex habits of ancient Latin is put on bright display in Ellen's most recent book, Freud's Rome, Psychoanalysis in Latin Poetry, which came out from Cambridge in 2009. This is a book that doesn't just talk about repressed things bubbling up to the surface. It shows that effort to not quite manage to repress in action in a fantastic series of case studies from Catullus, Virgil, and Ovid. To my mind, Freud's Rome is the best book out there on its chosen topic, certainly, but it is also the best book out there on Catullus, and it doesn't actually purport to be a book on Catullus. Ellen's take on the apple tumbling from the guilty girl's lap in Catullus 65 is itself worth the price of the book. Nor is it, technically speaking, a book about Ovid, and yet it manages to be the best study of the songs of Orpheus in Ovid's Metamorphoses that you'll be able to find, and so on. But I need to leave it at that and let Professor Oliensis speak for herself, since that's why we're all here. We will have time for questions after the talk, and we definitely want to encourage an active post-lecture Q&A. And we have a nice reception waiting for us, and here I need to thank, this is a co-sponsored lecture with the Department of Comparative Literature, and we have David Quint up front along with Dudley Andrews, and we want to thank them and exemplify our wonderful cooperation in this event. For now, please join me in welcoming Professor Ellen Oliensis, who will talk to us this evening on the topic of the authorial perversion, the desire for discourse in Ovid's Amores.
Thank you. That was just like the sweetest. Oh, thank you so much. That was the nicest introduction I've ever had. It was all for the benefit of my child, I'm sure, right? Thank you so much. I'm really gratified by the invitation. It's a huge honor to, speak for the Parry lecture. And it's also very nice to be back at Yale. And it's hard to believe that just a few years ago, I was a freshman, like a few floors down. Seriously, I was in this very entryway of Bingham. More than a few years ago. I snuck into this library once or twice, but it was not actually easy to get access to, so I feel good being here. Can you all hear me back there? Because I am trying to avoid a microphone, and I feel like it's okay? Okay, well, so this paper, I'm currently working on Ovid pretty much all the time, and this paper is sort of some material from the last chapter of a current book on Ovid's Amores that is kind of nearing completion, I hope. So there's a lot of stuff that comes before, but I don't think you need it for the purposes of this talk. And the other thing I would just say is that there is a handout, but it is really unnecessary. I think classicists always have to have handouts, or it's just not a classics talk. But you could actually listen to this. My goal is to have this talk be listenable and comprehensible without a handout at all. So I just say, also, I'm not going to flag things on the handout. Don't worry about the handout. It's there if you want to look at it, but you don't need to. Okay? All right. So it is an old chestnut of the scholarship on love poetry that the lover has to suffer so the author can succeed. Though there do exist poems celebrating erotic fulfillment, these are the exceptions that prove the rule, satisfied lovers being no more the stuff of poetry than happy families of fiction. After all, if the lover regularly succeeded, he would have no occasion to plead, grovel, threaten, or complain. That is, he would have no occasion to produce the erotic discourse which constitutes the fame of the author whose name he shares. Thus, it is really the case that the sufferings of the lover are the delight of the author. And this is true even if the author happens to be authentically in love and actually suffering the torments of unrequited desire, since in his authorial capacity, he cannot but capitalize on the distress of the character who represents him within the erotic fiction. This is a truth, however, that love poetry is deeply committed to obfuscating. Indeed, it is probably not an exaggeration to say that love poetry grows on the grave in which this truth lies buried. The protagonist of love poetry doesn't share the author's enthusiasm for suffering. He doesn't embrace frustration because it provides opportunities for verse making. On the contrary, he makes verses one way or another to allay his distress. This foundational fiction is neatly encapsulated in the Catullan phrase, uritur et loquitur. The lover is on fire and he speaks. That is, the lover is on fire and therefore speaks. One of the most notorious features of the Amores is the insouciance with which Ovid discards this fiction. It is not just that the Ovidian lover is an incorrigible womanizer whose rhetoric is transparently insincere, but that the supposed sufferings of this lover are disclosed from the first as nothing more than grist for the authorial mill. In Amores 1:1, Ovid tells us that he was all set to write an epic poem when Cupid intervened and abruptly terminated his epic career. Arms and savage wars was I preparing in weighty meter to produce, with the matter matching the form. The lower line was equal to the upper. Cupid laughed, they say, and snatched away one foot. What makes this opening so witty and so shocking is not the mere fact that when the curtain rises on this collection of love poems, the poet is not in love. It is the fact that Cupid intervenes not by making him fall in love, but by attacking his meter, leaving him with elegiac couplets on his hands and nothing to fill them with, as the irate poet, after roundly rebuking the mischievous god for meddling in the affairs of Apollo and the Muses, himself observes. Besides, I don't have any material suitable for lighter measures, no boy or girl with well-coiffed tresses. This is a problem Cupid can and promptly does solve by shooting an arrow through Ovid's heart, thereby making him burn, albeit as yet for no one in particular. But the damage, as far as the conventions of the genre are concerned, is already done. Here is a love poet who, instead of writing because he is in love, falls in love so that he will have something to write about. Scholars come at the Amores from many different perspectives, feminist, historicist, formalist, and they speak with many different voices. But on one point, they are practically unanimous. What the peculiar origin myth of the Amores discloses is that Ovid is writing not love elegy as such, but elegy at one remove, a project of disenchantment that scholars variously characterize as a savage parody or brilliant pastiche or clear-sighted demystification or mere encyclopedic compendium of the conventions of his chosen genre. The most extreme articulation of this position I have encountered is served up by Ralph Johnson in the introduction to his 2009 book on Propertius, and I quote, "As for Ovid, who came at the tail end of the elegiac project, his love poems, glittering with flawless technique and polished to a durable sheen by ruthless irony, concern themselves mostly with cataloging, as for a museum exhibit, the prime themes and tactics of love elegy, and with displaying them as a sort of gaudy collection of outworn cliches." Johnson's rhetoric may be extreme, but his emphasis on the inauthenticity of the Amores is absolutely representative. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that for most classicists today, the Amores have no erotic content at all, or at least none that is given to us immediately. If there is desire in the Amores, it is, so to speak, mentioned rather than used. The only scholar I know who takes the desire of the Amores seriously is Philip Hardy, who opens his suggestive pages on the collection with an astute appreciation of Ovidian vacuity, proposing that, quote, "the emptiness and unreality of the Ovidian erotic object and, quote, the writtenness of Ovidian scenes and narratives of desire, so far from being the symptoms of frivolity and detachment, are rather signs of a searching engagement with the structures and dynamics of desire." For Hardy, the essential revelation of the Amores is that the frustration of our desire to know Corinna not only follows from her status as a merely textual being, but also points toward a larger truth: the unavailability to desire of the woman in her real presence, forever screened from our eyes by a fetishistic textual substitute. In effect, what Hardy does here is to show the psychoanalytic implications of the dominant line on the Amores. The absence of any semblance of a realistic love object has its own realism in that it corresponds to a desire that is itself founded on irreducible absence. Hardy's reading is predicated on the assumption that what the lover desires, what we all desire, is the real presence of Corinna, and that the textual surface of the Amores is the substitute with which we have to make do in the absence of that presence. While I am a huge fan of Hardy's scholarship, the argument of this paper stems from my conviction that such an assumption does not do justice either to desire or to the Amores or to the pleasures explored and afforded by the Amores. The most effective antidote to the impoverished account of sexuality that dominates scholarship on the Amores is provided by Freud's 3 essays on sexuality. Popular opinion, Freud writes on the first page of the first essay, has quite definite ideas about the nature and characteristics of the sexual drive. It is generally understood to be absent in childhood, to set in at the time of puberty, and to be revealed in the manifestations of an irresistible attraction exercised by one sex upon the other, while its aim is presumed to be sexual union, or at all events, actions leading in that direction. Even 21st century readers may be taken aback by the trenchancy of the Freudian rejection. We have every reason to believe that these views give a very false picture of the true situation. According to Freud, the sexual drive does not come bundled with a particular object, heterosexual adult human, and aim, genital intercourse. On the contrary, he argues, a very little reflection suffices to reveal that the sexual drive and the sexual object are merely soldered together, and that the sexual aim is easily hijacked, even in purportedly normal people, by various forms of what Freud calls perversion. Freud classifies these as, on the one hand, extensions of sexual interest beyond the genital zone. This is where Freud locates the overvaluations of romantic love. And on the other, lingerings or fixations at preliminary or normally subordinate activities such as touching and looking. The road to normative genital heterosexuality is just one of a network of available paths, and it is really a miracle that so many arrive safely at the socially approved destination. Now, perversion carries implications of deviance, abnormality, and so on, but that is not at all how I mean the word in this paper. My understanding of perversion derives from the work of Jean Laplanche, who, on the basis especially of Freud's 3 essays, argues that for Freud, sexuality is in essence nothing but perversion. Laplanche takes as his starting point for Freud's observation that sexual excitation can arise as a marginal effect in the case of a great number of internal processes. To take a classic example, for the baby, the necessary action of nursing, which supplies food for life, also engenders as a marginal effect the autoerotic pleasures of sucking, pleasures which then take on their own life independent of hunger and the mother's breast. Infelicitous in one respect, in that it fails to bring in milk, the infant's intransitive sucking is a source of felicity in another register. Nor, I want to underscore, does this register derive its value from any nostalgic recollection of the missing milk. Sexuality happens somewhere else, and no amount of milk will do it any good unless milk has crossed over and entered the sphere of fantasy, in the process ceasing to be just milk. This is why Laplanche can describe sexuality in its entirety as, quote, the slight deviation, the clinamen from the function. And this is why he argues that sexuality is always already perverted, is constituted by and as perversion, the perversion of need into desire, or, as Laplanche puts it, the perversion of the vital function by sexuality. Late in the second essay, Freud suggests that sexuality can arise from any disruption, any agitation of the organism, physical or mental, once it reaches a certain level of intensity, and concludes, it may well be that nothing of considerable importance can occur in the organism without contributing some component to the excitation of the sexual drive. It is partly on the basis of this claim that Laplanche, and following Laplanche, Leo Bersani, locates the primordial agitation of masochism at the very heart of human sexuality. And I should say masochism is the subject of the previous chapter, not this one. The teleological model of desire, the model that yields the default assumption that the Ovidian lover's desire has or should have one object, Corinna, and one aim, sexual union, is an ideological imposition on the real waywardness of sexuality. It is this waywardness, I am convinced, that Ovid's Amores perform, and that constitutes the central attraction of this body of poetry, if not for scholars whose enthusiasm for the collection has always been somewhat muted, then for the innumerable readers who have taken pleasure in the Amores over the centuries. This waywardness extends beyond the narrowly sexual and encompasses what we might term Ovid's stylistic promiscuity. Already in antiquity, Ovid was notorious for his lack of aesthetic discipline, his puerility, his rampant exuberance. Seneca the Elder censured the licentia of his poetic diction and added that, far from being unaware of the flaws in his poems, he absolutely cherished them. Seneca the Younger likewise criticized Ovid for ruining his sublime description of the flood by adding the ludicrous images of wolves and lions paddling in the waves. Fooling around, says Seneca, the verb is lasciviere, when the whole world has been swallowed up. Quintilian is also severe on the subject of Ovid's style on 2 separate occasions, faulting the Metamorphoses for lascivia and observing that Ovid was too much in love with his own talent. It seems to me, the professor famously lamented, that Ovid's tragedy Medea shows how he might have excelled had he preferred to rule his genius rather than to give it free rein. These critics focus on Ovid's epic Metamorphoses because the conventional sobriety of the epic genre renders his stylistic excesses especially egregious. But what interests me here is how precisely their strictures suit the Amores in particular. A case in point is Amores 2:4. This is a poem that opens with Ovid acknowledging his faulty character, claiming to be racked by self-hatred, and lamenting his lack of self-mastery. He is like a rudderless ship at the mercy of winds and waves. What follows this self-indictment, and purportedly explains it, is a lengthy and perfectly cheerful catalog of the vast array of female types who solicit Ovid's desire, tall and short, urbane and uncouth, blonde and brunette, and so on and on and on. Commenting on this poem, Joan Booth remarks, "Nowhere does Ovid write with more wit and ingenuity, and nowhere with more fluency and grace," and then adds, "Yet nowhere does he more invite Seneca the Elder's famous criticism that he never knew when to stop." Lascivia, a term that encompasses not just a vice of style, but all forms of irresponsible playfulness, the friskiness of young animals, the flirtatiousness of young people, the sexual provocations of lovers, captures both the promiscuous content and the self-indulgent style of Amores 2:4, and indeed of the Amores as a whole. Earlier, I observed that in Amores 1:1, Ovid lays bare the foundational divergence of interests that love poetry is normally committed to occluding. The poet-lover wants to have sex, the author wants to write poems. But in fact, Ovid goes much further than this. What Ovid presents us with in the Amores is a poet-lover, and henceforth to avoid confusion, I will refer to him as Naso, who fully shares the author's goal of proliferating discourse. So it is not the case that the lover of the Amores has to suffer so the author can have his poems. On the contrary, Naso has to suffer so he can get what he wants, the agitating pleasures of the middle space where desire cohabits with discourse. This is what I am calling the authorial perversion. In the field of discourse, as of sexuality, Naso's perversion is one and the same. It is the detachment of the drive from its normative aim and the relocation of pleasure within the act of discourse. Nowhere is this detachment more directly represented than in Amores 2:19, the poem that closes the second book. This is the poem in which Naso berates a husband for failing to keep an eye on his wife, thereby making Naso's love life intolerably easy. Scholars have often wondered what this poem is doing at the end of its book, given that, unlike the poems that close books 1 and 3, this poem has no obvious programmatic content and enters no proud claim of authorial success. Yet the poem strikes me as very well suited to its position within the collection. Throughout this poem, what Naso is trying to forestall is the end, or even the end. This is why his closing address to the doltish husband gives so much play to the verb incipere, and this is on the handout somewhere. As for you, who are so careless of your lovely lady, start closing the door at nightfall already. Start asking who is furtively knocking so often at your door. And then again, a little further down, now I'm warning you up front. If you don't start guarding that girl of yours, she'll start to stop being mine. Nisi tu servare puellam incipis. Incipiet desiner esse mea. The climax comes in the next couplet as Naso spells out the proper roles of husband and lover. I've put up with a lot for a long time. I hoped it would be a regular thing, that when you'd done a good job of guarding, I'd do a good job of giving you words. Cum bene servaces ut bene verba darem. In Latin, the phrase dare verba, give words, carries the idiomatic sense of deceive or hoodwink, but here it carries something more than that. In The Art of Love, Naso excludes the rich lover from his classroom on the grounds that a man who is prepared to make gifts has no need of my art, while opening his doors to the poor. Me, I'm a poet for the penniless, since I was myself a penniless lover. When I couldn't give her a present, I'd give her words, cum dare non possem munera verba dabam, which I'd like to translate as, I'd hand her a line. In effect, what Naso is gloomily anticipating in Amores 2:19 is the removal of the stimulus for the production of elegiac lines. This is why, in the very next couplet, he is warning that the end is nigh. You're too pliable. You put up with things no husband should. As for me, there will be an end to this licensed loving. At mihi concessi finis amoris erit. The poem concludes with Naso ordering the husband, if he wants to retain Naso as his rival, to be obstructive. Me tibi rivalem siuat esse veta. The silence that follows, this is the last word of the book, certainly suggests that the husband has declined to comply. Now, it is true that Amores 219 is susceptible to a conventional reading. Other poets may confess that rivalry is the spice of love, but none discloses as blatantly as Ovid does here the mechanism that keeps love elegy going. Without some sort of obstacle to overcome, where would elegy be? The bizarre scenario of a lover demanding more vigilance from a lackadaisical husband draws attention, we might say, to the foundational divergence of interests I flagged earlier. The author wants to write poems, the protagonist wants sexual gratification, by staging their impossible convergence. The lover's suffering is thus exposed as the strictly generic requirement that it really is. This argument squares nicely with the traditional reading of the Amores as a demystifying critique of love elegy. What I'm advocating, by contrast, is that we at least consider taking Naso at his word by recognizing that the activity of dare verba is not just a means to an end, but erotically rewarding in its own right. And why shouldn't it be so? In an essay entitled Wrestling Sigmund, Harold Bloom responds to the account of the origins of sexuality provided by Freud and Laplanche with a prolonged, tragic sigh. Thus, human sexuality, alas, on this account, has not had from its very origins any real object. The only real object was milk, which belongs to the vital order. Hence the sorrows and the authentic anguish of all human erotic quest, hopelessly seeking to rediscover an object which never was the true object anyway. All human sexuality is tropological, whereas we all of us desperately need and long for it to be literal. It is the alas and the anguish and the hopelessly and the desperately that I am aiming with the help of the besotted wordsmith of the Amores to contest. Why should those of us who spend much of our lives revolving words, the ones we read and the ones we write, be so resistant to acknowledging the substantial pleasures they afford? Naso's logophilia puts a different spin on the theme of the failure of rhetoric in the Amores, to which Richard Tarrant some time ago and more recently Micah Madsen have drawn attention. The point is not just that Naso's rhetoric, though in principle it could succeed, does regularly fail, that Naso never actually represents his couplets charming open a door, or cajoling a girl into bed, or persuading a rival to ease up, or conversely to get tough. The point is that Naso seems to take care to ensure in advance that his rhetoric cannot but fail. Sometimes he does this by putting himself in impossible situations, as, for example, when he tries to persuade dawn not to break or a flooding river to subside. At other times, it is not the situation, but the approach that is doomed. In Amores 1:8, Naso represents himself overhearing Elena, a bawd or madam, instructing his girlfriend on the proper way to choose and use a lover. The gist being that wealth should trump everything, including poetry. "Tell me," says the bawd, "what does that bard of yours give you besides new poems? Now there's a lover who'll give you many thousands to read." 2 poems later, it is clear that his girlfriend has fully absorbed the lesson, and Naso is grappling with the challenge of winning her favor without paying for it. His strategy is to climb on his high horse, venting his disgust at her mercenary character and exalting the superior value of deathless poetry. "My gift," he indignantly reminds her, "is to honor deserving girls in poetry. Dresses tear, jewels and gold break, but the glory granted by song will last through the years." That this is just a tactic, and a hopeless one at that, is clear from the backpedaling conclusion that immediately follows. "It's not giving, but being dunned for cash that I resent and despise. What I refuse when you ask, stop wishing for it, and I'll give." But of course, there is no indication that Naso will make good on this promise, which remains suspended in the unrealized future of Dabo. Against this backdrop, I can't help noticing that the very next poem shows us Naso once again trying to score on the cheap. This is the famous poem in which Naso asks Corinna's slave Nape to deliver a letter to Corinna asking for a date. Though Naso spends much of the first part of the poem flattering Nape, evidently in the hopes of persuading her to do her best on his behalf, by the end of the poem he seems to have forgotten Nape altogether. If the mission is successful, it is the writing tablets, Naso's faithful servants, and not the faithful Nape, who will be rewarded for services rendered. The slippage between these two instruments of the master's desire, the slave and the writing tablets, has been much discussed. What interests me here is what I will call, adopting Kathleen McCarthy's terminology, the story world implications of this slippage. As it happens, in the course of the lecture Naso overheard in Amores 1:8, the bawd suggested that a girl bent on fleecing a rich lover would do well to enlist the services of her entire household. Her slaves, for example, can tell her lover what presents he should buy, while also asking for a little something on their own account, an extra something that the bawd indicates will go to swell the household coffers. Given that nape is an ancilla, in fact, this is the only other instance of the word ancilla in Amores 1, it is small wonder that the mission Naso entrusts to her ends in failure. Weep, everybody, for my misfortune. The tablets have come back in mourning. The letter says, can't today. Though Naso blames this outcome on the accursed materials of which the writing tablets must have been constructed, it seems more likely that Nape failed him and Corinna refused him because he put nothing more tangible than poetry on the table. On the one hand, we may decide that this fiasco is just more evidence of Naso's block-headed complacency. On the other hand, it is true that his decision to court Nape and Corinna with sweet talk, and only with sweet talk, effectively ensures that the need for verse remains as acute as ever. It is clear that Naso is not incapable of coughing up something other than couplets when it suits him to do so. In Amores 1:6, Naso appears before us in the classic posture of a locked-out lover, alternately flattering, supplicating, and haranguing the slave who guards his girlfriend's door. And yes, we are now on the second page, if you're interested. Okay. Yeah. As day approaches, Naso finally departs, leaving his garland on the stoop for his girlfriend to see, a sign of his fruitless vigil, and also offering a surprisingly generous tribute to the unyielding doorkeeper. First, the garland. But you, garland torn from my unhappy head, lie there all night on the hard threshold. When my girlfriend sees you thrown there early in the morning, you'll bear witness to my misspent hours. And then the doorkeeper. Such as you are, goodbye then, and feel the tribute I give you as I go. Senti quabeuntis honorem. Honor is usually understood as a reference to Naso's grudging praise of the doorkeeper's virtuous performance of his duty, which follows in the next line. Stubborn man, you who haven't disgraced yourself by admitting a lover. Goodbye. But such a turn from blame to praise has no parallel in the Amores, and hardly suits Naso's character as we have come to know it. The point, I think, is not that the doorkeeper has shown his independent resolve by withstanding Naso's verbal assault, but that he has played precisely the part he was supposed to play, the part Naso needed him to play. So I suspect that in this instance, honor carries its more substantial sense of a pecuniary tribute or tip. Alongside the garland, the departing Naso leaves a little something for the obliging doorkeeper who has enabled him to spend the night spinning couplets. So, though he won't pay to gain access to the house, he will pay to have the door securely locked against him. Naso's irrepressible desire for discourse spills out in the poem to Nape, and sorry, if you want to look, it's on the previous page. Here, Naso vacillates between the demand for rhetorical economy and the desire for rhetorical elaboration, writing as a prelude to sex and writing as a replacement for or even a form of sex. It is characteristic that Naso wants Corinna to reply both at once and at length, lines 19 to 22. Nec mora, per lectis res scribat multa, iubeto. Order her without delay to write a long answer. I hate it when there are blank spaces in the shiny wax. Let her pack the lines in their ranks. Let my eyes linger on letters scratched at the very edge. Naso's desire spreads to everything associated with Corinna, including the marks in the wax that indicate the pressure and carry the erotically charged metonymic trace of her writing hand. Carving letters into wax is an old figure for procreative intercourse, with a wax tablet representing the blank female material awaiting masculine inscription. So there is a double perversity in Naso's desire for Corinna's writing, a quantity of verses, as he calls them, that holds up a mirror to Naso's own prolix appeal. After indulging in this fantasy, Naso pulls himself up short. Why should she wear out her fingers holding the stylus? Let the entire tablet hold a single word. Come. The minimal reply Naso is hoping to receive matches the brevity of the oral message he entrusted to Nape along with the tablets. If she asks me what I'm up to, tell her I live in hope of a night. The rest is on the wax, marked by my coaxing hand. This quick exchange, I'm living in hope of a night, so come, would be the pragmatic preamble to a sexual encounter, not its perversely elaborated discursive replacement. And in fact, one imagines Naso might have fared better on this occasion had he foregone the blandishments and restricted himself to this minimal solicitation. As Richard Tarrant has pointed out, throughout the Amores, and in fact throughout Ovid's work, there is an inverse relation between quantity and efficacy. That is, the more Naso talks, the less he achieves, and vice versa. The limit case is the famous sexual encounter of Amores 1:5, an exceptional scene of erotic success, as Tarrant remarks, which unfolds without a single word being spoken on either side. The point is driven home by Amores 1:13, where Naso is actually in his girlfriend's arms when he composes his doomed appeal to the goddess of the dawn, an elaborate Ovid that takes place against the background of an erotic coup that involved, so far as Naso lets on, no persuasion at all. The single representation of possibly successful erotic persuasion in the Amores is the exception that proves the rule. In Amores 2:2, Naso addresses himself to the severe eunuch who has been assigned the task of watching over a girl who has caught his eye. What interests me here is the contrast between Naso's long-winded appeal, the poem is in fact the longest in its book, and the embedded representation of maximally efficient communication that motivates that appeal. Here are the opening lines of the poem. Bagoas, you who are charged with watching over your mistress, please give me your attention while I go through a few relevant points. Yesterday, I saw a girl strolling in the portico that has the row of Danaids. Since I liked her looks, I immediately sent and asked for a date, misi scriptoque rogavi. With a trembling hand, she wrote back, can't. And when I ask why not, the reason she gives is your irksome watchfulness. This rapid-fire exchange of notes, roughly, how about it? Can't. Why not? That annoying slave, sets the stage for the full-scale rhetorical assault on Bagoas that follows, the soisoria proper, as McKeown terms it. But at the same time, it discloses, as if inadvertently, that Naso is fully capable of using language both efficiently and effectively. In sum, Naso is not just obliging Ovid by making opportunities for verse. Naso does not fail just to enable Ovid to succeed. On the contrary, failure appears to be a non-negotiable demand that Naso himself imposes on his own rhetoric. I want to underscore that Ovid didn't have to write the story this way. A pair of poems from Propertius's first book of elegies, in which Propertius first laments that Cynthia is going off on a sea journey and then rejoices that she has succumbed to his pleas and canceled her trip, shows the availability of an alternative. The point is not that Naso never succeeds in having sex. On the contrary, it is clear that he very often does. The point is that those successes are never associated with a successful rhetorical appeal. Indeed, the very possibility of such an association is sometimes raised only to be ostentatiously severed. The love letter that Naso entrusts to Nape fails to win him the night with Corinna for which he was hoping. Yet in the very next poem, Amores 1:13, there is Naso lolling about in bed, spinning his doomed plea to dawn, having enjoyed just such a night with a girl who remains nameless. An even more pointed disjunction is produced in the second book, where Naso laments Corinna's decision to go off on a journey, and then in the very next poem boasts exultantly of his amazing victory. Corinna is in his arms. It is impossible not to think of the pair of Propertian poems to which I just alluded, but even readers who have never read Propertius will initially assume that the triumph is the consequence of Naso's persuasive performance in the previous poem. But in fact, Naso makes it very clear that this is not the case. What he has overcome and there is no indication in the poem that his eloquence played any part, is not Corinna's decision to go abroad, but the conventional obstacles, the husband, the chaperone, the locked door, that prevent a lover from gaining access to a woman trapped within a domestic space. So it is almost as if Naso were fending off the very possibility of rhetorical success, as if such a success would decisively cancel the pleasure he takes in the performance. I'd like to end this paper with a brief discussion of the poem that opens the third and final book of Amores, Amores 3:1, most of which you'll find reproduced on the handout between the second and third pages. There's a lot of text there, and I'm not going to talk about all of it. Like Amores 1:1, this poem is a narrative retrospect, but this time when the curtain rises, Naso is not busy writing an epic or anything else, but wandering in a sacred grove, seemingly at loose ends, looking, he tells us, for a work for my muse to set in motion. Quod mea quaerebam musa moverat opus. So it is true, the husband Naso, accused of criminal indifference at the end of the previous book, has not mended his ways. Enter not one but two applicants for the position of muse, fetching elegy, dressed in silks with an elegant coiffure and a seductive limp, and scowling tragedy in buskins and a long mantle, brandishing a scepter in her hand. Though elegy enters first, tragedy overtakes her with violent strides and seizes the initiative, chastising Naso for his scandalous goings-on and urging him to abandon elegy for the grown-up and manly genre represented by herself. Next, stepping between her poet and his severe suitor, elegy first acknowledges tragedy's superior gravitas and then mounts a spirited defense of her own talents and services rendered. And the poem ends with Naso politely postponing tragedy and committing himself to one last book of elegy. In Amores 1:1, Cupid transformed Naso into a love poet. The burden of Amores 3:1, however, is not that desire determines what the poet writes, but that writing is what he desires. I can clarify what I mean by this claim by setting it against Maria Weich's influential work on the elegiac mistress. In Weich's famous formulation, this mistress is a scripta puella, a textual body that incarnates her author's aesthetic and ideological ambitions. Amores 3:1 bulks large in Weich's argument because this is a poem featuring two women, elegy and tragedy, who are indisputably textual entities embodying contrasting aesthetic and ideological positions. The resemblance between flirtatious elegy and her flimsy silks and the flesh and blood women Naso pursues elsewhere in the Amores implies, in Weich's view, that these women are likewise to be understood not as specific individuals living in Augustan Rome, but as purely textual entities, signifiers in an authorial message with an aesthetic, Callimacheian, and ideological, anti- or para-Augustan, gist. This demystification is, moreover, the very burden of the poem. Quote, Amores 3:1 is designed to mock and entomb the absurdity of reading amatory poetry as real. While Weich's textual emphasis has done much to invigorate scholarship on elegy, I find her argument and the general line of interpretation associated with it very hard to accept. There are many degrees and kinds of reality short of the quasi-biographical referential model specific individuals on which Weick seems to be relying. The names Cynthia and Corinna may not denote particular historical persons, but this does not invalidate the reality effect, such as it is, of the poetry in which they appear. Contrariwise, and this is the point that matters most to me here, textual entities are themselves part of reality, with as good a claim to the label real as mountains and emperors. A lot of work on elegy seems to operate on the assumption that the discovery of a metapoetic subtext entails the evacuation of the erotic content, as if poetry and desire occupied entirely separate spheres, as if their relation could only be metaphorical or allegorical. What I am suggesting is that the association of the personified elegy with Corinna and her kin communicates not only the elegiac woman's essential textuality, but also, and conversely, the erotic appeal of writing. Tragedy is also a form of writing, of course, but in Amores 3:1, she is associated with the eradication of lascivia at all levels. That is, not just Nasa's juvenile escapades, but also the infelicitous expansiveness that constitutes the peculiar felicity condition of his unsuccessful rhetorical performances. The impatience conveyed in tragedy's opening salvo, "Will you ever make an end of loving?" an interesting inversion of Nasa's reproach to the impassive husband of Amores 2:19, is capped by the impressive gesture with which she punctuates her speech. "Now," she says, "let me, Roman tragedy, gain a name through your agency. Your spirit will meet and match my conditions." She stopped there and, resting on her embroidered buskins, moved her head with its thick mane of hair 3 times and 4. Hac tenus et movit pictis in executornis densum Caesariae terque quaterque caput. This gesture, which is patterned on the cosmic nod of Jupiter, belongs to the mode not of persuasion, but of fatal declaration. The speech confirmed by such a nod must come to pass. It is as if tragedy were trying to get rid of the very necessity of rhetoric by erasing the gap between speech and its effects in the world. Now, as elegy well recognizes, nothing could be better calculated to repel Naso than such a posture. Elegy's first riposte, accordingly, is to replace tragedy's definitive nod with a markedly equivocal gesture. The other, if memory serves, glanced smiling sideways, altera si memini limis surisit ocellis. The reticence of elegy's glance is reproduced by the uncertainty in Nasa's recollection, si memini. Elegy is glimpsed through a seductive aura of doubt. The erotic charge is amplified in the next line. Am I deceived, or was there a myrtle staff in her right hand? Deception being naturally an essential seasoning in Nasa's affairs. It is as if Nasa were experiencing in the present of writing the shiver of excitement provoked by elegy's arch glance, the thrill of a private communication made right before tragedy's uncomprehending eyes. In effect, as John Davis has pointed out, elegy seduces Nasa by giving him a delicious swig of his own medicine, making him the audience of an adept rhetorical performance that he can enjoy all the more because, as her collusive glance indicates, elegy knows from the start that she has already won. The erotic charge of elegiac rhetoric is encapsulated in the verb to move, a verb that is equally at home in rhetorical and erotic contexts. According to Cicero, in a formula taken over by Quintilian, moving the audience is one of the orator's essential tasks, the others being giving instruction and giving pleasure. Within the Amores, movere conjures up not only the modes of persuasion directed toward opening the door to sexual intercourse, but also the intransitive agitations of the sexual act itself. In Amores 1:10, for example, Naso argues that he shouldn't have to pay his partner for sex since this is a pleasure taken by the woman and the man moving in concert, quam socio motu femina virque ferunt. And at the end of 2:10, he hopes that death will come upon him when he is engaged in his characteristic activity, the motions of Venus, veneris motu, which is surely both poetry and sex, right at the middle of Book 2. Likewise, when the personified tragedy pontificates that it is high time Naso be moved, or with a middle sense, simply move, under the impulse of a weightier thyrsus, tempus erat tirso pulsum graviore moveri, the sexual innuendo is so plain as hardly to count as innuendo. Whether or not tragedy is to be imagined as a cross-dressed man, like her counterparts on the tragic stage, her rhetoric puts Naso in the position of a kinidas, a gender-deviant male associated with provocatively sexual movement, kinidos, the word being associated with Greek kinein, to move. It is as if, within the Amores, where rhetoric never succeeds in moving anyone, the Ciceronian triad had been compressed and displaced into an intransitive movement of which the only effect is pleasure. In fact, there is an awful lot of moving going on in Amores 3:1, far more, as it happens, than in any other poem in the collection. As the poem opens, Naso is looking for a work for his muse to set going, quod me acquirebat musa moverat opus. Tragedy auditions for the role by waving her scepter around, movebat, and bobbing her head, mowit, all in the interest, as we have seen, of persuading Naso to move under the impulse of a weightier thyrsus, that is, an inspiration more serious than that supplied by elegy. As elegy points out at the beginning of her response, however, for all her weighty words, tragedy has condescended to move or proceed in elegy's own lightweight meter, imparibus tamen numeris dignata moveri, while Corinna herself has learned from elegy to slip out of the house at night without stubbing her toes, movere pedes. Given Naso's interest in elegy's mismatched feet, a metrical pun here is pretty much inevitable. By the end of the poem, the passive senses come to the fore. Grant the bard just a bit of time, tragedy, Naso pleads. You are a work for the ages. What she asks for is so short. And tragedy assents. Mota dedit veniam. Though aiming to move Naso, tragedy ends up being herself moved by him. This unique instance of rhetorical success is the exception that proves the rule, in that what Naso's plea wins is not admission to the bedroom, not an opportunity to dispense with elegy, but the license to produce more couplets. Let me end this paper by letting elegy speak for herself. Unlike tragedy's speech, elegy's speech is full of surprises. After some disarming self-depreciation, I wouldn't venture to compare your sublime poetry with mine, and so on, elegy proceeds to make a case for herself. It is she who, as the bawd and companion of Venus, renders love civilized, and it is she who educated Corinna in the ways of furtive love. But the real reason she deserves to have sway, she says, and here I'm following Kenny's slightly transposed text, is that she has put up with humiliations to which proud tragedy could never submit. Lines 53 to 58. How often I hung fixed to an unyielding door, unabashed at being read by people passing by. I even remember lurking miserably in the folds of a slave's dress, waiting for the brutal chaperone to leave. And what about when you send me as a birthday present, and the girl tears me up, the savage, and drowns me in water she had on hand? The downward trajectory is very dramatic, and it is accelerated by the evaporation of the personification. She who entered the poem in the guise of a beguiling woman, the bosom companion of Venus, is reduced by the end of this passage to mere paper. And this paper has its own degradation to suffer, passing from the door where it can be read by all and sundry to the hiding place where it lurks in hopes of a single secret reader, to the water basin in which it forfeits the very possibility of legibility. Alessandro Borghese has observed that Ovid is perhaps the most daring of ancient poets in personifying texts and animating books. And in its remarkable combination of personification and animation, elegy as muse and elegy as talking book roll, this passage is more daring than most. Of course, elegy's very ability to chronicle her own misadventures indicates that she has outlived them. She is not, after all, fully present in any particular material instance of her text. So this moment of degradation may also serve to confirm elegy's indestructibility. Just as Naso predicts at the end of the first book of Amores that he will in large part survive the funeral pyre, so elegy demonstrates that she has survived the utter obliteration inflicted on her material corpus by dismemberment and drowning. Even so, what comes next is a surprise. From the nadir of the water basin, elegy vaults to the high ground, even the highest ground. I was the first to set your mind's fertile seeds in motion. It is my gift to you that she is pursuing you now. Elegy ends by identifying herself as not the material product, but the original source of Naso's inspiration, not the gift, but the giver. I am most struck by line 59, prima tuae movi felicias semina mentis. The language here is overwhelmingly philosophical, conjuring up Anaxagoras, who held that the world was made of seeds, set in motion by mind, along with Aristotle, who likewise identified mind as the prime mover, prima tuae movi, and also Lucretius, who argued contrariwise that mind, mens, was itself composed of very tiny seeds. But elegy's sublime argument cannot be boxed up, so far as I can judge, within any existing philosophical theory. The motion she produces in Naso's mind fuses creative ferment with erotic excitement, a prototypically Nasonian combination. Thank you.